Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today for Remember, Reflect, Recommit. I'm Greta Maris, a sophomore majoring in International Studies and Political Science. I'm minoring in Environmental Studies and I'm also a Happy Votes Ambassador. On behalf of the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins, I'm excited to welcome you to today's panel, Women Working Across the Aisle. SNF Agora is a relatively new institute at Johns Hopkins that examines its challenges to democracy and identifies actionable solutions. They are hosting this conference to recognize the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment and to bring researchers and practitioners together with the Johns Hopkins community and the general public for a discussion about the history of women fighting for civil rights, including the right to vote, to show how crucial women's participation is to thriving democracy, and to inspire future civic engagement. With us today are Senator Barbara Mikulski, who represented Maryland in the US Senate for 30 years and is the longest serving woman in the history of Congress, Ambassador Connie Morella, who served as a congressional representative from Maryland from 1987 to 2003, and as a permanent representative from the US to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development from 2003 to 2007, and Delegate Brooke Lierman, who has represented Maryland's 46th legislative district since 2014. Welcome, everybody. Our panel will spend about 35 minutes discussing the unique perspective women bring to legislating, including how they craft policy, how they create environments where other women can succeed, and how women working together may help to heal our current political divides. Then Delegate Lierman will open the discussion up for your questions. Anytime throughout this conversation, you can submit your question through the dialog box, which is right next to the video, or just below it, depending on your device. Thank you all for being here. I will turn the conversation over to Delegate Lierman and see you all at the end of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Greta, for that great introduction and for all your work. Here's hoping that soon things are safer and you can be back in person at Johns Hopkins for classes. I am so honored and thrilled to be here today with all of you, with two amazing dynamic women. I was thinking, today, Maryland doesn't have any women representing it in the federal delegation in the House or Senate, but we have an incredible legacy of strong women leaders representing us in DC, including Senator Mikulski and Congresswoman Morella. And I have a personal connection with them both that I'm going to speak about just for 1 second before we turn it over to questions. Congresswoman Morella actually helped me get my start in politics. In 2000, I was living in Montgomery County, or I was in college, but my family lived in Montgomery County, and my father, Terry Lierman, decided to run for Congress against Congresswoman Morella. And so I was his volunteer coordinator as a dutiful daughter, and had my first true campaign experience. And of course he lost, but it was an amazing experience. I met so many people and really developed a love for field organizing and campaigning. And I'm really proud of the work that Congresswoman Morella has done and did in representing Maryland. So I'm thrilled to be with you here today. Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you. Senator Mikulski, where I'm sitting right now at home, would not be here if it were not for Senator Mikulski. I am in Fells Point right now, an incredibly vibrant and historic neighborhood in Baltimore City. And Senator Mikulski led and was one of the leaders to help make sure that years ago, decades ago, nobody built a mega highway through this neighborhood, tearing it down. And because of her activism and her work and her organizing with people, they were able to preserve this and other very important communities in the city of Baltimore that we love and cherish today, and really make it what it is today. So I'm so excited to be with you both today. Thank you for taking the time to be here. Senator Mikulski, so you started your career as a social worker and a community activist, as I just mentioned, stopping the interstates. And Ambassador Morella, you were a teacher and an advocate for women's rights who helped found the Montgomery County Commission for Women. Could you each take a couple minutes to talk about what prompted you to run for office and what politics looked like at that time, particularly for women?
Well, Brooke, I'm going to jump in, and I, of course, want to thank Ambassador Morella Congresswoman Morella. She has so many titles, and I think we just agreed that for purposes of ease of conversation, like our constituents, we'll call each other by our first names.
Good policy.
Growing up in Baltimore, I never thought I would go into politics. Politics was the last thing on my mind. And unlike you, Brooke, my family was not involved in politics. We were involved in community. My mom and dad were involved in ethnic heritage organizations, the church, etc. Politics was dominated by pot-bellied guys who ran political machines, and it was a different era. But when the expressway was proposed, I was invited to join in the fight. Now, in the battle of the expressway, and I think Congressman Morella will talk about this as well, behind me, it was never behind me, there was a whole lot of we. And we have to talk about grassroots advocacy. We were talking about not only the expressway, but that we hadn't had a new school in over 100 years, that our library didn't go beyond run, puff, run. And there were so many issues. And as we knocked on doors, we were unheeded, unheard, dismissed, and disregarded. Well, that made me very cranky. And I decided rather than knocking on the political doors, I would run for a political office. But I want to emphasize, none of us gets here by ourselves. Behind every me who gets elected, there's a whole lot of we that back us, and they back us because they want their community to be a better place, and they want the lives of their families to be in a better place. And I think that's what motivated us. We sought power not for ourselves, but to empower our community.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. Congresswoman.
Yes, I associate myself with the remarks made by Barbara, whom I've always looked to as a leader, paving the way. And Brooke, it was interesting that you have a connection to both of us, which indicates how women can influence and help other women. My epiphany came back in the 70s. I was, as you suggested, teaching at the community college and was on the first commission for women. At that time, if I wanted a credit card, I had to have a male sign for me, if you can believe that. And when you looked for what a profession could be for a woman, you looked in the newspaper and there was a section for women and a section for men. And you could see that women could be like a waitress, a clerk, maybe a secretary, but could not be a construction worker, an engineer, a doctor, or a lawyer. So when you looked at those inequities, and at the same time, on a federal level, we had a woman in Congress, Martha Griffiths from Michigan, who introduced the Equal Rights Amendment. She actually got it passed. It was just incredible. So in the states, at the same time, while I was on the Commission for Women, we were trying to get our colleagues who were in the state legislature to approve it. It had to be approved as a constitutional amendment. And so therefore, I saw these inequities. So I would say it was the women's movement that put the movement into me. And from that moment on, it was constantly on my mind. And I decided that if I didn't have a seat at the table, I might be on the menu. So that inspired me, using some of my connections with friends, not so much a political party, but friends, to decide to run for the state legislature.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. That's great history. And of course, Maryland did not have a wonderful history in terms of ratifying the 19th Amendment, right? We did not ratify it, and we sent ambassadors to Tennessee urging those representatives not to ratify it. So it's good to know that you were working here on, decades later on behalf of another amendment, the ERA. That's fascinating.
But it's also good to know, when you talked about Tennessee,
yeah,
Harry Byrne, who is the one who said yes, he listened to his mother. So you see a woman behind the scenes making things happen.
Yes, absolutely. And for those of you who don't know, that's a great story and worth reading about. You, of course, were both, some of the earlier women in the chambers, and there just weren't very many women in office, and we're not at equity yet, but then there were many fewer women. How are you treated by your male colleagues, by the press, or by your constituents? I know in the Senate, you weren't allowed to wear pants on the Senate floor when you took office. I mean, what was it like to be one of the very few women for you in your chambers?
Well, I must
First
say,
of all, getting started, I have a saying that says, men of quality always support women who seek equality. And I found that at times it was generational difference, and it was also men who were more reform-minded, that were welcoming and supportive. But our first battle was with public opinion, in which we were judged often by not what we said, or what we did, or what we were proposing, but by what we looked like, what we sounded like, and we were often criticized for that. Oh, Barbara, you know, when I was running for both the city council and Congress and then the Senate, you don't look the part. And as Gloria Steinemann's famous saying is, this is what the part looks like. And it's because I didn't have gray hair and this glamour, you know. So one, we were criticized for that. The second thing is that women are often criticized for the way we speak. We're either outspoken too much or we're too soft-spoken. We don't speak enough. So we're continually evaluated and judged, except by the people. And when women can do grassroots organizing, the sweat equity campaigns that all three of us have participated in, where we can tell our own story and listen to the stories of others, because the best ideas come from the people, we could get ahead. But I can say that along the way, I was helped. I have to do a shout out by Senator Paul Sarbanes. He was my champion, helped me get started in the Senate, got me on the right committees. But again, I'll come back to the good guys who always stood with us that helped break the ice.
I very much appreciate what Senator Mikulski has said. But when I was elected, she was elected to the Senate. I was elected to the House. She had already served in the House. She was one of 2 women in a body of 100. And it was so, and you know, it's interesting, Barbara, because you had Nancy Landon Kasbaum, a Republican, and Barbara Mikulski, a Democrat. They worked together beautifully in a very bipartisan way. I was elected and there were like 24 women in the House of Representatives out of 435. And it was pretty closely equated in terms of Democrat Republican. Isn't that interesting? So you again had a sense of the bicameral nature and the bipartisan nature of a Congress, what it should be. How was I treated? Well, very often it would be, oh, we really like the outfit you're wearing. You look so cute. So what I learned to do is to look at my male colleague and to say, oh, and you look so cute. I really like that. And they suddenly take notice of what I meant by it. I also found that women had to work harder to be taken seriously. Very often at a committee, it would be, I would make some statement. It would be, oh, Connie, thank you very much. And then it would be Congressman Smith make the same statement I would make. And it would be, oh, Congressman, that was so wonderful. I was Connie, but that was Congressman. That was so wonderful. So finally, I learned that what I would say is, well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate what Congressman said. It was the very same thing I said, and I appreciated the fact that he agreed. And so you had to find ways at that time. Now, they know better, I hope. If not, we stop them immediately. But my point is, women had to work harder to be taken seriously. Once you establish that reputation, that they knew you did your homework, that you were trustworthy, and they would listen a bit more. So you had to earn any bit of respect, whereas for a male, it could be a Dumbo and be immediately looked on seriously.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. You know, it is interesting that it was more evenly split among Democrat and Republican for women when you were elected, because we've seen it's not like that anymore. is unfortunate.
Delegate Lierman, so are the women in our delegation. Even when I went to the Senate and Congresswoman Morella came to represent the Montgomery County area, we had 2 Democratic women. You had Ev Byron, but anyway, you had Connie Morella and you had Marge Holt.
Right.
Wasn't she in the delegation then, Connie?
Mhm.
So there were 4 women in the House delegation, 2 Republican and 2 Democratic women.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing. We've gone from so many women representing Maryland to none today. We have to work on that. Nothing against our male congressmen and senators who we love, but yes, there's definitely needs to be a seat for women too.
That says something about the fact that we need to assist these women, first of all, to interest them in running for office, to know that they can make a difference. And then secondly, to give them not only mentoring, but to actually give them support. I mean, for instance, there is such an imbalance. You mentioned the number of women currently now in the Congress, but I must say, there is no 2-party system when it comes to women, because you have almost no Republicans. That number has gone down, and in both the House and in the Senate, which says that if that party wants to continue, it's going to have to do something to look at why do we not have women running? Why do we not have them making it through primaries?
Yeah. Yes. Oh, absolutely. And you were always recognized as a moderate, I think, who was really willing to reach across the aisle to collaborate with your House colleagues, to represent your constituents. And you had particular interests that were important to women, domestic violence, sexual harassment, reproductive rights, child support, women's health, equal access to education, housing, employment, a panoply of issues. And Senator, you were known for, and you are known for, forging really lasting relationships across the aisle in the Senate among women. And you were the dean of the women senators. And I'm curious, I'd love to hear more about how you worked with your colleagues to push your agenda forward and how you rallied support on women's issues in a climate when there were so few women to begin with.
Well, first of all, we're coming upon the 30th anniversary of 2 very important pieces of legislation and legislative initiatives in my life. One where we worked across the aisle and worked across the dome. And this goes to really Congresswoman Morella, which is the women's health agenda and getting women included in protocols of research at NIH, where we were systematically excluded. And the other was saving the Hubble telescope, which had a fiasco in space and had to be saved. So it was in science and technology. But let me talk about really the women's health agenda, because I think it's a model of what happened. When I was in the House of Representatives, this was before Congresswoman Morella joined the Maryland delegation. The women in Congress had a Congressional Women's Caucus. And in my day, it was chaired initially by Congresswoman Holtzman, then Pat Schroeder, and Congresswoman Heckler, a wonderful Republican who went on to be ambassador to Ireland from the Republican side. One of the issues that came up that we heard from the women's community was that women were systematically excluded from some of the protocols at NIH. Working as a congressional group, we got study after study that showed that it was true from the IG's office. We also held hearings on it, but we kept being blown off, dusted off, and so on. I carried that agenda with me to the Senate. Congresswoman Morella comes in. NIH is still dragging. And in fact, an esteemed professor of Johns Hopkins came and testified at one of our hearings that women should not be included in the protocols because we had raging hormones. And I said, our hormones raged because of comments like that. Yeah. But again, because the Congresswomen, through their caucus and the diligence that Connie just described, had done the homework. I worked with Nancy, but I also worked with Senator Ted Kennedy at the hearings. So he empowered me to carry that portfolio. And then I'll never forget the day when NIH was dragging and throwing, where Congresswoman Morella, Congresswoman Olympia Snowe, and I had the proxy of Senator Nancy Kassebaum, went to NIH to confront them, not for them to disregard science or the scientific method, but was it the scientific method or were they blindsided by sexism? And what we found, of course, was that there was very little scientific reason, from they didn't have bathrooms to what about this and so on. And I've got to do a shout out for Congresswoman Morella. Those were her constituents. That was a very brave and bold thing she did. But you see, that's when we had an agenda that started in the House. It started with the Congresswomen meeting a common goal, how to include women's health and how to be included in basic research.
Right.
We got facts, we were prepared, and then I carried it to the Senate, working with good men, Senator Kennedy, Senator Arlen Specter. We then confronted NIH, and we then passed legislation establishing the Office of Women's Health at NIH. It is now celebrating its 30th anniversary.
Great.
And in that, we got Dr. Bernadine Healy to be the first head of the Women's of NIH. And if I could just give, what did it mean? And I know Congresswoman Morella will be very proud of this. With Dr. Healy, and we got her the funds, again, working with some of the good guys like Senator Specter and Senator Harkin, her famous hormone replacement therapy study, which showed its contributing factor to breast cancer.
Right.
That study changed medical practice. And before Dr. Healy passed away, and I get very emotional about that, in one of my last conversations with her, the data showed that study and the push by Dr. Healy resulted in lowering breast cancer rates in this country by 15%. So women working across the aisle, women working across the dome, working with science and letting science be science, but not science being blindsided by old-fashioned ideas, we really have saved lives a million at a time.
That's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that story.
I agree with what Barbara said. And it was the kind of thing where there was no research being conducted on female animals. They did use male rats. I think that's kind of interesting. Now with the Office of Research on Women's Health, they are including female animals in all of the research. But, you know, we also said there is a male gene and a female gene, but there's not a Republican gene or a Democratic one. This is something where we work together. And that was a great example. And as Barbara has said, 30th anniversary, they're continuing to forge ahead. There's still more work that needs to be done. They're now even looking at COVID-19 and its effect on women. But we had women on HIV, AIDS, autoimmune diseases. Number one killer of women was heart disease. People never realized that. So much has been done with that, and that was done bicameral, bipartisan. And I'm glad that Barbara was there as a foremother and that I had a role to play too.
You had a big role. And I have to really say, Congresswoman, that was your congressional district. So for you being so willing to go out and challenge them to ask only to give us the scientific reasons, because one of the things we all shared in common across the aisle and across the room, we believed in science. We believed in the scientific method. What we did not believe that, you know, we needed to have scientific reasons why we wouldn't be included in the protocols, or common sense, like we wouldn't be in prostate cancer research. But you were very bold to be willing to do that. And I think the story needs to be told about how women were willing to step forward to put principle over politics and really to push the common good over politics. So
yeah, I mean, that's an especially, I think, interesting anniversary to have this year, because although, you know, many of us know about the disparities in health that are occurring, I think with COVID-19, everybody, you know, many people have started understanding that diseases don't affect everybody equally. And, you know, we've seen huge racial disparities in how COVID-19 works. And it's interesting to see, will be interesting to see if there are also gender disparities. And so, you know, I think we think of, oh, there's one healthcare system, but of course there isn't one healthcare system, and not everybody has access to the best healthcare. And even just the basics of healthcare research and medical research, you know, that we assume is being taken care of sometimes. I think people are learning now that it's not. And, you know, so battles like that are so important, and I think very timely in the discussion of ensuring that we are testing vaccines on, you know, women and people of color, and making sure, and, you know, not just white men.
Well, that's right. And I think we need women at the table to pound the table if necessary on the issues around intersectionality. And I would say both the Congresswomen's Caucus really worked in terms of, not only across the party, but there were a substantial number of African-American women in the House, and continue to be so, and outstanding members. And but I think right now, as we go into the very fact that science is being challenged, we need to stand up for science. We need to really stand up for scientists, but we have to continue to encourage. We need to look at the disparities in our country and the intersectionality of it. And I think this is where a woman's voice, our vigor, and our persistence and insistence must play an important role.
Barbara mentioned the women coming together. On the House side, we had the Congressional Caucus on women's issues. We had a little room which used to be the Speaker's room, which then was now the Congresswoman's reading room. And it was right off of the Statuary Hall, a little room. We still have that room. Well, you know, what's interesting is that John Quincy Adams, after he was president, then became a member of Congress. And he was in that room because that was the Capitol, the House chamber. And then he got a heart attack. They took him into that little room, which later became the Congresswoman's reading room. We later dedicated that. He died on the sofa there, which is still there. Later we dedicated the room to Lindy Boggs, and she was there. This was like 1989. And she said, she looked up at the statue of John Quincy Adams, and she said, well, John, your father didn't listen to your mother, Abigail, when she said, remember the ladies. But I'm sure that she's finding some comfort knowing that you are here, surrounded by strong women.
Cool. That's great.
I think that was the case.
That's great. You know, Ambassador Morella, in 2016, when Senator Mikulski was retiring, you told the Baltimore Sun that the pipeline for women was leaking. And, you know, we have been talking about how few women, or there are no women representing us at the federal level from Maryland today. And I'm curious, what advice would either of you give to women who are considering, you know, whether to get into politics or not, and how to make that decision? Any advice from either of you that you'd like to share?
Well, of course, I said the pipeline was leaking when you lose a Barbara Mikulski.
Yeah, I know, it's quite a hit.
It's also reflective of the fact that we had been losing some women, you know, periodically, and we just needed to get more women to run. And all the studies that had been done indicated that women sometimes felt, oh, I don't have the ability to do it. I don't have the PhD credentials or whatever. I don't have the money. I don't have the support. Baloney. They do. So I think it's to do all we can to ensure kind of confidence in women that they can do it, that they can make a difference, that they will, and for the rest of us to kind of help them with ideas, with how to raise money, with how to present themselves. And I think the parties need to do something. The Republican Party particularly needs to, because so often you will find women who may want to run, who may have the credentials to run, and then they see this lineup of guys, the guys who have bonded together. Well, of course, a male should be doing that. So the stereotypic notions of the fact that the man is stronger, baloney. I think they have to forge ahead, and they're beginning to do it. Don't you think, Barbara, that women are beginning
Yes,
to
I
show
think
up and
so.
begin to run?
What I would say to young women, the way that you get started into politics is to get started in your community or get started in volunteering in a political campaign. Get a taste of it. Now, you got started as a community activist in Montgomery County. I, community activist in Baltimore. Pick an issue, get to know people, and try to take your passion and turn it into policy. You're going to learn a lot about how to do that. Build friends, build networks to lay the groundwork for running. And then also, in terms of volunteering in a campaign, see what it takes to really get out there and run. It's just not mouthing off opinions. And I say to every woman who comes to ask me about running, that every woman running for office needs a mom. What do I mean by that? First of all, you have to have a clear message about why you want to run and why should it be you to accomplish what you're saying. Second, you need an organization to get out your message, and you need the money to be able to pay for part of the organizational efforts. It was great that Brooke was the volunteer coordinator for her dad's campaign, but we're in a very different world. You do need paid staff, media, etc., to really be able to do this. So I think the best way is be involved. You know, Congresswoman Maura, Connie, I think you feel the same way, and you too, Brooke. The joy of being involved in a career in public service is so rewarding, so satisfying, that it's worth the frustration, the setbacks, the bruises that we've had to take from time to time, and so on, because we know at the end of the day, we've tried to make the world a better place. And when I think back now, just on some of the things that we worked on economic security of women, women's health care, research, etc. So get out there and give it a go, and don't overthink it and don't overanalyze it. Get involved, and then getting involved will take you to the next step.
No guts, no glory. But I'd like to point out something else too. Women, they have to run, and with all of the instrumentation that you mentioned, people involved, but they've got to know that if they don't win, they can run again. Very often you'll find women will run, and if they lose, they say, oh, there's no way I could go back. Just look at our presidents and see that they have run and lost. I mean, whether it's Clinton or Bush or whatever, they have lost elections and they've come back again. Right. And with women, very often we figure that we're not liked by the electorate, so we won't run again. So to have the guts to run again, I think is important.
Right. That's an interesting point. I appreciate that.
That's an experience.
Yeah, that's true. It looks like we're ready to take a few questions from the audience. And so to everybody out there, if you have a question for our panel, you can ask it through the dialog box on the screen to the right or below the video, and I hope to get to it. First question is, how can we as constituents better reach across aisles to other states? You know, we may be preaching to the choir in Maryland, but we need to reach those in other states. What's the best way to do that? Any advice on that?
I think, first of all, find out if there are organizations or entities in those states that you want to reach that feel the same way you do, or close to the way you do, or your group feels. Because I think it's groups that make a difference, communities that make a difference. They can start off with one person, but you've got to spread the word. And members of Congress, if they hear from one person in another state, I'm sorry, not my constituent. Yeah. If they heard from a group in another state that is similar to a group in their area, then they're more prone to listen. So I say build your own coalitions. Find out what's in those states that might have an appeal to your issue.
Well, and I think it's also where you have a commonality. So it's what states do you want to reach across? I think both Connie and I would say, well, are we reaching to Utah? But there is the Delmarva. And when we look at Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, and particularly the Delmarva Peninsula, we have a lot in common. From working to bring broadband to the Eastern Shore to internet connectivity for our kids. So whether you're in Bethany or Rehoboth or Pocomoke or Wallops. So that's one thing. The other is look at the way we work, Connie, in terms of Maryland and Virginia on transportation issues. When we look at the Beltway, how we had to work to bring transportation, new bridges across. We literally had to build bridges across the Potomac, and our first bridges were building political alliances with it, from working on cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay to kind of the major transportation issues. So you look at the states where there is some affinity already and then build out from there. But would I recommend Maryland young people trying to reach out to Utah or Montana? Well, maybe on climate change, because it is a national issue. But let's look at what is nearby and what we have in common and what we would be working on together, whether it's transportation, internet connectivity, which is a big thing. The digital divide is so serious in terms of our boys and girls having access to the internet so that they can go to school.
Mhm.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. It's a huge issue. I mean, and it's one that we have to tackle immediately, both at a federal and state and local level. Yeah. So another question that I think is very relevant, and that I have, certainly have a number of friends and who are dealing with this, and just so many constituents too, really struggling. The pandemic has reminded us how often women carry the load of childcare in our families. And of course, our childcare facilities are hurting right now. Any advice to working mothers who want to get more involved in politics, but feel pressured for time? Or I'll add, feel guilty because they could be with their kids, but they are, want to do some political work. How do you speak to moms and working moms about some of these challenges?
Well, I think you go with where you might have the time, and you also go with the candidate who actually speaks to these issues. So the time, for example, might be phone banking. Phoning is where you work for a candidate and you call a list of people you're either trying to make sure they're registered, the voter or whether they've asked for their ballot or not, which I really would encourage. Please be asking for your ballot and have an election plan, but to participate in things that you can do from your home on your own time. And I also would say, go for the candidate that is actually speaking to these issues about available, affordable, and safe childcare, or any kind of care, including elder care.
I agree. I remember when we passed the Family and Medical Leave Act,
Right.
and but we're still the only country that doesn't pay for that leave. But we are moving ahead, but very slowly. Same thing with childcare. It's needed now more than ever. We're beginning to find more childcare facilities finally being built, including around the Capitol. But now this is an unusual situation where we are socially isolated, so you are dealing with it in the home. I think Barbara's recommendations were very good. I also say get the daddy to also spend some of that time when he is working at home to take care of the kids. Then he will understand what you have been trying to work out and are working out throughout the time. So I think looking to legislation and benefits that may accrue because of this COVID-19 and the recognition that childcare is critically important. Also look to your spouse or whoever the man is in the house, if there's a man in the house, and also to look to possible legislation in the future.
Yep. There are a couple people had the same question, which I thought was interesting, about the bipartisan gatherings that Senator Mikulski, you used to host, I guess, a tradition of hosting women senators for off-the-record dinners that were bipartisan. And I'm sure you accomplished so much that way in terms of building relationships and trust. And there, several people asked, are there still these bipartisan gatherings happening, or have they fallen off in today's polarized environment? Any idea?
Well, first of all, they came about because of Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson reaching out to me, and I'll come back to that. What is going on now, because of the uneven way that people are in session, they were doing kind of after work drinks and appetizers and then moving on. But there's still an attempt to do that. Now, let me tell you what happened. So for a long time, it was only Senator Kassebaum and I in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And she was a very dear and esteemed colleague. But with the Year of the Woman, after the fiasco with Anita Hill, more women came. Now, there is no operating manual on how to be a senator. I learned a lot from mentors, and again, Paul Sarbanes, my champion, about not only the formal channels of power, but the informal channels. So I kept a lot of little notes, and I ran, when the women came, an empowerment workshop. Well, the media wanted to know whether I was holding a tea. And I said, no, a power workshop. They wanted to know. Well, I said, just watch us. But it was really how to get started in the Senate and so on. Now, along the way, Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson got elected to the Senate from Texas.
All right.
She called me, and this, if I could just take a minute to tell the story. And my staff said, Senator Hutchinson called you. And I said, oh, I'll call her back, get her number. And so my staff said, ew, what do you want to call her for? She's that Republican. In the meantime, Senator Hutchinson, when she was going to call me, her staff said, ew, what do you want to call Barbara Mikulski? She's that mouthy liberal from Maryland. Well, Senator Hutchinson was calling me about the inequities in women's retirement of an IRA, that if you worked in the marketplace, you could put in, at that time, $2,000. But if you were a woman working at home, you could only, your money, you could only put in 500. So I called her back. She told me about it. We began to work on the issue. We decided to go out to dinner to talk about strategy and methods for moving our agenda forward. I thought she had a fabulous idea, and I was all in with her. And we had such a good time at the dinner because we talked about each other, our lives, what brought us to politics. So we decided to invite the other women, and that began the dinners. But guess what? We found we disagreed on so many issues. Some were pro-choice, some were not, some were pro-life. Some were for the balanced budget amendment. I certainly was not. There were other things. But guess what we agreed on? First process, that for the women of the Senate, we would be a zone of civility. That when we disagreed, we would not be demonizing each other, that our debates would always have intellectual rigor, facts, and proceed from there. The other thing that we agreed on was more money for breast cancer research at NIH. That was the beginning of how we worked together. We took only those two things, and we had 3 rules: no staff, no memos, no leaks, and no men. We only had dinner with 2 men. One was a man by the name of Barack Obama, and he was president of the United States, and invited the women to come over and have dinner, and we went to the White House. The other was John Kerry when he was leaving the State Department and wanted us to come over to thank the women, and Connie as an ambassador of our country, to thank us for the role that the Senate women played in promoting democracy and meeting with people from around the world, including dissidents and marginalized people, and the role that we had played in human rights, in human rights. And so that's how all that got started. and we continue to do it.
That's
But
great.
it's harder.
It's a great
Yeah.
story. On the
That's a
House
good story.
side, we had the Congressional Reading Room where we would come together and we would discuss issues and try to get others to join with us in co-sponsoring or talk about a problem that we had. I must say that changed in 1994 when Newt Gingrich became the speaker. At that point, a separate entity was established, the Women's Congressional Policy Institute. I am
Huh.
on their board, and they do wonderful things of bringing in a bipartisan way women on both sides of the aisle to discuss issues, but to also have situations where, for instance, they invite the women ambassadors of other countries to come together to talk about what we have in common. And it's very much the respect that I think of George Washington's rules of civility and decent behavior. Number one, when in the company of others, act with respect for those who are present. And that is what we try to do. And that's, again, one of the things I think women tend to be more apt to bring to a situation. Civility, respect for each other.
Yes, no, I mean, I agree. So we're about to wrap up, but I'm hoping that each of you could take sort of 1 minute to tell us on this Friday, lovely Friday afternoon during an incredibly challenging time in our country for so many reasons. Could you take 1 minute each to tell us, what are you optimistic about? What are some of the things that make you think, positive thoughts about where we are headed as a country or communities or women's or anything? I would just love to hear from you what you're optimistic about before we end.
Well, I'm very optimistic about our young people. I have been tremendously impressed, whether it's being here at Hopkins or being involved in a community way also as I've left the Senate these last 4 years. Their idealism, their savvy and know-how in bringing innovative ideas, their desire to make not only their community, but the world a better place. And I'm very, very impressed by their passion, their commitment, and really the kind of new, fresh ideas that they're bringing. And I think we think of one generation, we really need to open up and find ways of listening to this new generation and helping them learn how they take passion and turn it into policy and into programs, whether in our country or for the world.
I agree that seems like I'm always agreeing with you, Barbara. I do. I think not only young people, but I'd like to even expand that. I am finding that this COVID-19 crisis is bringing out the best in many people. I'm finding, again, with my little walk, signs that say, help each other, or thank you, essential workers. We're looking more at the people who are helping, those people who are making these masks, doing them as volunteers, or helping to serve others, giving them food. I think it is bringing out the best in many people. And I hope that will continue beyond this particular difficulty. I do find young people, particularly with regard to the environment, young people are our leaders, thank God. I mean, it's going to be their future.
Yeah.
And so I like seeing that happen. I like seeing more women, again, take the lead in all areas, whether it's Citibank or whether it's in Congress. And finally, I am just so pleased that at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, they're naming a building for Grace Hopper, who was like amazing Grace. She went, a ship in port is safe, but that's not what ships are for. Sail on. So I would say to the viewers, sail on.
Very nice. So it looks like we're coming to the end of our discussion here. It's been wonderful, just really inspirational and interesting and riveting. Senator, Congresswoman, thank you both so much for being here today. Thank you for all that you have done and continue to do for Maryland and for our country, for our young people. It means so much. So know that you matter to me and you matter to so many people who are watching and around the state and country. I think I'm going to turn it back over to Greta now. There she is, just like magic. Greta, I'm turning it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Delegate, Senator, and Ambassador, for joining us today. And thank you to the audience for watching and for sending us your great questions. We invite you to tune in to our next panel at 2 p.m. this afternoon, titled Women Working Across the Atlantic, a discussion among women who have held high-level positions in foreign relations and national security. They will share their experiences working to ensure U.S. safety and to foster democracy around the world, the specific role they have played in protecting and promoting women's rights internationally, and why it's so important to include women in our country's efforts abroad. More information about the panel and other conference events can be found online at snfagora.jhu.edu. Thank you.
Thank you, Greta.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Barbara, good to see you.
Bye.